evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. Xi Jinping was in Tibet this week. No one knew about this until today, when the Chinese state media finally released pictures of this three-day visit. For the first time in 30 years, a Chinese president has travelled to Tibet. What for? To prove to the world that the Communist Party is in control of the once troubled region. But during this visit, Xi Jinping had a message for India too. He inspected several projects and sites that were barely a few kilometers away from the border with India. Beijing is recruiting young soldiers from Tibet, building railway lines to the border, building a dam on the Brahmaputra. As the tensions prevail at the border, China is throwing a new challenge for India in Tibet. We'll tell you how New Delhi can tackle this, how India should see this visit of Xi Jinping to Tibet. But first a look at Gravitas Global Headlines.
China's urban planners get a taste of future disasters as climate experts predict that the country will have to equip itself to live with record rain. This as at least 51 died in Zhengzhou in the Henan province due to catastrophic flooding, while an approaching typhoon threatens to dump more rain. The White House calls Chinese opposition to an investigation into the origin of COVID-19 irresponsible and dangerous.
We continue to call for China to provide the needed access to data and samples. And this is critical so we can understand to prevent the next pandemic. This is about saving lives in the future.
Beijing has criticized a request by the World Health Organization to audit labs in China, where the first cases of coronaviruses were found. Former United Nations Rights Chief Navi Pillay to lead the UN's inquiry into the human rights abuses in Israel and occupied Palestinian territories. The probe is aimed at scrutinizing the root causes of the decades-old Middle East conflict in light of the recent violence seen in May. Police in Jammu in India have shot down a hexacopter drone and recovered a 5-kilogram improvised explosive device from the downed drone. Sources say the drone may have been transporting IED to terrorists to be used in a terror attack. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei says those protesting against water shortages in the country cannot be blamed, calling officials to deal with the crisis. Many civilians are feared dead in the protest against the water crisis in the drought-hit southwest region. The Delta variant now comprises more than 80% of new cases found in the United States, putting pressure on some of the country's hospitals. Despite rising cases, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has not revised its mask guidance, which says fully jabbed adults do not need to wear masks in most public places. The Philippines became the first country to approve commercial production of genetically modified golden rice. Experts say this nutritious form of rice will help to combat child blindness and save lives in the developing world. Taiwan now faces a plastic pandemic as lockdowns led to a surge in online shopping and food deliveries amid a surge in COVID cases. This is a big blow to the island nation's efforts to reduce consumption of single-use plastic. Taipei produced 10.79 tons of recyclable waste in May this year. The Tokyo Olympics are officially underway with a subdued opening ceremony inside the national stadium. even as protests against the staging of the games continued outside. Less than 1,000 guests attended as a result of COVID curbs. History was created as the Greek team marched into the stadium with the first ever instance of male and female flag bearers. A very small Indian contingent was led by boxing legend MC Mary Kom and hockey captain Manpreet Singh. The archery competition at the Tokyo Olympics is underway, and South Korea turned in a dominant showing to top both the men's and women's ranking rounds. An San broke a 25-year-old Olympic record in the women's event with a score of 680 out of a possible 720, while the three-member team also set a combined record. In the men's round, 17-year-old Kim Ye-duk took top spot with a score of 688, ahead of American world number 1 Brady Ellison.
For the first time in 30 years, a Chinese president has made a visit to Tibet. The first in 30 years. Xi Jinping was in Tibet this week. What for? To mark 70 years of China's annexation of Tibet. They call it the liberation of Tibet. Look at these pictures. This is the moment when Xi Jinping arrived in Tibet. This happened on Wednesday. The Chinese state kept the visit a secret. The pictures were released only today. A group of locals were stationed to welcome the president. They're carrying the Chinese flag. They're dancing. The red carpet has been rolled out and Xi Jinping is waving at the crowds. Why is this our top story? Look at the location. All this was happening just 16 kilometers away from India, 16 kilometers from the line of actual control, the de facto border between India and China. This place is called Ningchi. It lies to the north of India's Tuting sector in Arunachal Pradesh. And the setting is just one part worth noting. The entire visit is laced with messages for India, carefully choreographed to project strength. Xi Jinping wanted to show India, and indeed the rest of the world, that he's in complete control of Tibet and its borders. After pushing Tibetans into mass labor camps and suppressing their cultural and religious freedom, the Chinese president lands there with an entire filming crew. Look at these pictures. What you see are drone shots of Xi Jinping. It was intended to be a grand affair. With all this paraphernalia, the president is leaving this site near Arunachal Pradesh for his next stop. What is the next stop? The Brahmaputra River. The Chinese call it the Yarlung River. The president drove to a bridge here. This is the upper course of the Brahmaputra. The river begins its path from here, and China wants to build what it calls the world's biggest hydroelectric project right here. A dam that could be used to dictate the flow of the waters of the Brahmaputra. Beijing could control the flow to India, dry up the lower basin, or release too much water to cause a flood. It would have a direct impact on India's northeastern states, like Assam. Xi Jinping went to the potential site of this dam. He also inspected a railway line. Last month, remember, China opened a bullet train line, one that links Lhasa to Ningchi. Reports say this railway line is just 17 kilometers away from the border with India. It is one of the several major infrastructure projects completed near the Arunachal border. The Chinese president calls these projects, quote-unquote, a major step in safeguarding national unity, because they go beyond just transporting people. When this railway line was opened, a former in charge of China's Tibet policy issued a statement. He said the same railway line can act as a, quote-unquote, fast track for delivery of strategic materials if a crisis develops at the border. And we all know what kind of crisis this official was referring to, the possibility of a war with India. In recent years, the Communist Party has made moves to tighten its grip on Tibet. The borders are being militarized, thousands of soldiers have been deployed, and this deployment serves two purposes. Number one, it needles India by raising tensions at the disputed border. And number two, the deployment helps in keeping a tab on potential defectors. And China, you must know, is paranoid about this, about defectors, which is why the Communist Party does not even grant passports to many Tibetans. It wants Tibetans to prove their loyalty to the party. In fact, China is coming up with a new form of loyalty test for the people of Tibet. Reports say China has now made it mandatory for each Tibetan family to send one young male to the military. These orders have been issued in specific areas. That's because Beijing wants to step up the recruitment of young Tibetans to the PLA. Because they know the terrain, they're accustomed to high altitudes. They can serve better on the border with India. China's endgame in Tibet is to instill party loyalty, to crush Tibetan culture, to replace Buddhist monks with Communist Party officials. Xi Jinping made that clear with his visit to Lhasa, the capital of the Tibet province. And where did he go in Lhasa? The Potala Palace, the same palace that was once home to the Dalai Lama. Reports say the Chinese president addressed the locals there. He told them, and I'm quoting, "As long as we follow the Communist Party and as long as we stick to the path of socialism with Chinese characteristics, we will surely realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation as planned." In other words, follow the party, the rest will fall in place. Unfortunately for Xi Jinping, the world sees Tibet for what it is. It's another matter that the world doesn't choose to do very much about it. Beijing's actions will end Tibet as we know it if they continue doing what they're doing. And this cannot be allowed to happen, should not be. And this is where India comes in. For decades, the Tibetan government in exile has kept the Buddhist culture and traditions alive in India. India has a shared history with Tibet. For centuries, it was an autonomous and independent Tibet that shared a border with India, not China. But after Beijing annexed Tibet, the region has become the chief flashpoint between the two countries. Our next report takes you back in time to tell you how Tibet has impacted the India-China relationship and in many ways how Tibet has shaped this relationship.
The year was 1914. The place was Simla. The occasion was the signing of a historic treaty, now called the Simla Convention. The treaty delineated the borders between India and Tibet. India wasn't free then, it was represented by the British. But Tibet was still an autonomous territory. Its leaders agreed to the Simla Convention. China refused to sign it. 36 years later, Tibet lost its autonomy. In 1950, China took control of Tibet and dumped the Simla Convention. 9 years later, China cracked down on Tibetans and forced the Dalai Lama and his followers out of Tibet. By then, India was an independent country. It took the Dalai Lama and his followers. This event in 1959 marked the end of a free Tibet and the beginning of a dispute that still casts a shadow on India-China relations. China says India is meddling in its internal affairs by hosting Tibetans. The Chinese military became increasingly aggressive after India gave asylum to the Dalai Lama. This led to the 1962 war, when Chinese troops carried out a simultaneous attack in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. The war completely shattered diplomatic ties between India and China. It took them 14 years to start talking again in 1976. But a serious dialogue on Tibet began only in 1988. That's when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China, the first Indian leader to do so since 1954. Beijing tried to get India to recognize Tibet as a part of China. New Delhi refused. A joint press release declared Tibet an autonomous region. That's how things remained for the next 26 years. Then in 2002, another dialogue on Tibet began. China started talking with the envoys of the Dalai Lama. 1 year later, India, under Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, signed a joint declaration. India endorsed the One China policy and recognized Tibet as a part of China. This should have ensured peace, but China stoked tensions again. In 2006, China staked claim over the entire Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. They called it South Tibet. India responded by omitting references to the One China policy from its statements. Since then, China has been pushing aggressive claims on the border with military action. Border skirmishes became frequent from the Tibetan side. A major provocation happened in Doklam in 2017. Followed by the Ladakh border standoff that began in 2020 and still continues. The Modi government has attempted a shift. In 2017, the Dalai Lama was allowed to visit Tawang, a small town in Arunachal Pradesh, despite Beijing's vocal opposition. And this year, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi wished the Dalai Lama on his birthday a few weeks back. The first such public acknowledgement since 2013. India has tried all approaches with China. Beijing's response hasn't changed. It wants absolute control. It wants to change Tibet, destroy its culture, change its demographics, and subdue its people. China is pumping big money to build military infrastructure at the Tibet border. Now, Xi Jinping's visit is another message. China is playing an aggressive game. The ball is in India's court. Bureau Report, World is One.
So the Chinese president is taking a stroll near the Indian border. What's his message to India? Because this is clearly more than inspecting a train. The new helmsman does not bother with such trivial things. So how must New Delhi perceive this rare visit? With China, you see, things are never direct. They're masters of the long game. So is this bravado genuine or just another reel for the propaganda film? There are some clues in history. Mao Zedong talked about the 5 fingers of Tibet: Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh. 5 fingers, and he said that Tibet was the palm and that these territories were the 5 fingers. You'll notice that China does not control these regions. 2 of them are sovereign nations, the other 3 are Indian territories. But when has that ever stopped Beijing? Mao Zedong believed that it was China's duty to liberate these regions, in other words, annex them. He couldn't. Can Xi Jinping do what Mao could not? We can say one thing for sure. The Chinese president has been seduced by this prospect. He wants to one-up China's founding father, do better than Mao. So to answer the first question, yes, these pictures are for the propaganda reel, but the bravado is still genuine. Beijing wants to keep this border active. Their adventurism in Ladakh, you see, backfired last year. So this time, they're preparing harder. We've seen evidence of this already. Tibetan youngsters are being lured into the PLA. China is banking on local knowledge, something that they lacked in the Galwan Valley. That's part 1 of the operation, recruitment. The second part is to upgrade infrastructure. China is building a series of villages along the border. Nearly 628 of them have been constructed, 628 villages along the border with India. We say villages, but these are actually defense posts. And China's plan is to dot the border with them. So here's another question. Is China showing off or is it preparing for action? A lot depends on this city. Opposite Arunachal Pradesh, it's called Ningchi. It's a military base protected by S-400 missiles, no less. China is bolstering this outpost. If push comes to shove, this could be the staging ground for PLA troops. The new railway line here is no coincidence. It's not about connectivity. It's about transporting troops. So from a military standpoint, China is bulking up. What about the politics? China does not recognize the McMahon Line. This is the British-era border that demarcates Tibet and India's Assam. It forms the northern border of Arunachal Pradesh. China does not accept this. It claims Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. When Indian leaders visit the state, China starts hyperventilating. In 2009, when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh visited Arunachal Pradesh, China raised grave concerns, quote unquote. In 2019, Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited the state. He announced a series of development projects. China said, don't escalate the border situation. And when the Dalai Lama visited the region, China cried of serious damage to bilateral relations. Basically, China's message is this: stay away from Arunachal Pradesh. But that's not Beijing's call to make. We're talking about an integral part of India, a full-fledged state of the Indian Union. Plus, what moral ground does China have? They regularly build barracks and villages on disputed land, and when there is a backlash, they turn around and say, we've not agreed on this border. And that's a very convenient argument. The fact is that China has no interest in settling the border dispute. It wants the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. So how must India respond to this? We're talking about extreme landscapes here. So the first priority must be infrastructure. Roads, railway lines, military bases. Keeping up with the Chinese build-up. This came to India's advantage, remember, in the Galwan Valley. The Chinese soldiers were grossly underprepared, both for the terrain and for the fight. It's important to keep that edge across the border. As for Xi Jinping's visit, India must read between the lines. Beijing may have tamed Tibet, but the people of Tibet, they've never embraced China. So what does she do? Whitewash discontent with communism, stamp out Tibetan Buddhism, and sinicize the community. He wants to consolidate the palm before clenching the fist. India should understand the challenge and prepare to deal with it. 5 days on, the Pegasus saga is still unfolding. New names of potential targets continue to emerge, coupled with new beliefs that they were being spied on. There are indications that more names will emerge and a possibility that more authoritarian governments will be named. On Wednesday, France became one of the first countries to launch a probe into the revelations / claims. Many others have followed suit. Which countries are these? Are they the villains in this alleged scandal or the victims? Our next report tells you.
The Pegasus saga continues to make headlines the world over. New names are emerging each day. New accusations are being flung. Several countries have launched independent probes. In France, President Emmanuel Macron's iPhone is said to have been compromised. Naturally, the matter is being taken very seriously. The French president has changed his phone and his number. Crucial cybersecurity meetings are underway. And an investigation has been launched to find out if the president's phone was really infected and whether any data was withdrawn. In Hungary, which is the only European country listed as a potential user of Pegasus, government officials have dismissed all allegations. But the judiciary is not convinced. Hungarian prosecutors have launched a probe to examine if their government was secretly gathering unauthorized information. In Algeria, the Pegasus project claims the government and Algerian citizens were being spied on using Pegasus. No names have been taken, but fingers are being pointed at neighboring Morocco. Algeria and Morocco have repeatedly sparred over the disputed region of Sahara. Now Algerian authorities have launched a probe to find out if Morocco was indeed trying to destabilize their country. Out of the 50,000 phone numbers mentioned in the Pegasus project, a third are based in Mexico. The Mexican Defense Ministry and several intel services are all believed to be in possession of the software. On target were apparently journalists and human rights activists probing drug trade in the country. The software was bought during the term of President Enrique Peña Nieto. The current president, Andrés López Obrador, has ordered a probe to confirm if it was misused.
TechBull Group is a company with characteristics of a front company set up by a private security firm. It should be noted that in 2014, the Tech Bull Group contracted the Pegasus software and the Pegasus malware. Along with the Attorney General's Office and Chief Director of the Criminal Investigation Agency, this software was used for the purpose of telephone espionage.
Pegasus, el malware Pegasus.
One of Cyber Week. Everything's under attack. Our water...
In Israel, the country the Pegasus software belongs to, a commission has been set up to review the allegations made. This commission will probe if the NSO group was aware about its software being misused. The NSO group too has launched its own probe. But given how the group has to get all deals approved by Israel's defense ministry, it's anybody's guess if the two concurrent probes will yield anything. There are calls for a fresh probe and new surveillance reforms. But the government insists that it has nothing left to prove, especially with the consortium behind the investigation already having played investigator, prosecutor as well as the jury. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Our next story is from Canada, where the society is perfect and the Prime Minister faultless. At least that's what they would have you believe. Justin Trudeau is what you call a lab-made politician. Hollywood looks, son of a Prime Minister, has a comment on everything under the sun except when trouble hits home. That's when Justin Trudeau ducks and runs. I have a few videos for you tonight. They're from Toronto in Canada. A few dozen people had camped out in the city's west. We're talking about homeless people here. They had nowhere to go. So they pitched their tents in this public park. What happened next was classic police state stuff. Trudeau's thuggish cops arrived at the park. They wanted to evict these people, not by asking them to leave, but by smashing them with batons. These pictures are disturbing. We strongly advise viewer discretion. Those videos are difficult to watch. Evicting the already homeless is the pinnacle of state apathy. And remember where this is happening, in the utopian kingdom of Canada, where every politics is welfare politics. Do you know what this overkill was for? To remove 17 people. 17. What has the Grand Vizier of woke politics said about this? Nothing. No tweet, no flick of the hair disappointment, no apology. Was the Prime Minister too busy? Doesn't seem like it. He had enough time to tweet about the Olympics. Looks like Justin Trudeau has an acute case of political hyperopia, what we call long-sightedness. So Trudeau can see protests in India. He can see the ice melting in the Arctic. But police brutality in his own backyard, that's too blurry. Let me remind you what Trudeau said about the farmers' protest in India. Canada will always be there to defend the right of peaceful protest. We believe in the importance of dialogue. Couple of questions for the Prime Minister. Were these homeless citizens not peaceful? Were the protesters who supported them not peaceful? Why was the default response to attack and arrest these people? Trudeau won't answer. In fact, this has become his brand of politics. When tough questions are asked, he responds with a brooding silence. Unfortunately for him, this is not high school. Sheepish smiles won't cut it. I'll give an example of his double standards. Last year, Indigenous communities in Canada were protesting. They wanted to scrap an oil pipeline project. A group of them blocked railway lines. Do you know what Justin Trudeau did? This is what he said. The situation is, as it currently stands, is unacceptable and untenable. Then he goes on to say, it has been 2 weeks and the barricades need to come down. For more than 6 months, protesters have been camping on major roads near India's national capital, the same protests that got Trudeau's attention and sympathy. Do you know how long the Canadian blockade lasted? 30 days. Trudeau himself made the statement after 14 days of the blockade. So what's the yardstick here? Trudeau can evict homeless people. He can condemn indigenous protests, but still call himself the savior of democracy and free speech. By the way, his cops stand by what they did in Toronto. In fact, they seem proud of it. One officer claims that they did a quote-unquote tremendous job, that minimal and proportionate force was used. Seems like Trudeau's cops are more delusional than him. What happened in Toronto should not be forgotten. 26 people were arrested, dozens more were beaten up. All of them were punished for the state's failure. And heading the state is a man consumed with his own supposed greatness. Power corrupts, we know, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When John Acton said this, he forgot to add that power also knows no limit. Once you taste it, you cannot stop, it seems. Case in point, the Afghan Taliban. They claim control over 90% of Afghanistan's borders, and now they want more. The Taliban is setting the terms of engagement. What do they want? The Afghan president's ouster. They say President Ashraf Ghani must step down. Why? For the sake of peace, they say. Taliban leader Suhail Shaheen gave an interview to the Associated Press. He said the Taliban will only lay down their weapons when a negotiated government is installed in Kabul. In other words, for there to be any scope for peace, President Ghani must go. Now let's get one thing clear. The Taliban is not interested in peace. It wants power. It wants Kabul. It wants to install a Taliban leader as the leader of Afghanistan. It wants to restore the Islamic Emirate, to establish a Sharia regime, a theocracy. The Taliban wants to once again rule Afghanistan, and that's exactly what they're working towards. Did the world see this coming? Of course it did. It all began when the US decided to legitimize the terror group by bringing it to the talking table. Washington weakened Kabul by leaving it out of the talks completely. In February 2020, the US struck a so-called peace deal with the Taliban. It happily agreed to the complete withdrawal of troops. In exchange, the Taliban agreed to not use the Afghan soil against the security of America and its allies. Did any peace flow out of the deal? Forget peace, the Taliban refused to even agree to a ceasefire. They continued fighting Afghan forces. 1 month into the deal, headlines in the US media said the White House has intel that the Taliban will not abide by the agreement. By April, the Taliban leadership was openly threatening to overrun the Afghan government. It has not even been a month since US troops left the Bagram air base, and the Taliban is already putting riders for peace, dictating the terms of engagement, demanding the removal of a democratically elected president. This is a classic example of why terror and talk should never be allowed to go hand in hand. It is also a reminder of America's massive failure in Afghanistan. And where is Kabul in all of this? Afghanistan's defense ministry says the Taliban's claim of controlling 90% of Afghanistan's borders is an absolute lie. His words, absolute lie. Quick reminder, the Taliban claims to have captured Afghanistan's key border crossings, including the ones with Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Pakistan. Kabul insists that government forces are in control of these frontiers. Again, there is no way to verify these claims from either side. There are no clear answers for anything that's happening in Afghanistan right now, but here's what's crystal clear. Afghanistan is a security concern for the entire region. There is fear of violence spilling over and a fresh surge in migration. Afghan civilians and troops are already fleeing to neighboring countries, including Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Afghanistan's southern neighbor Pakistan has refused to take in more refugees. Tajikistan says it is ready to shelter up to 100,000 refugees. What if the numbers exceed 100,000? Dushanbe says it will then be forced to turn to international groups for help. Meanwhile, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar met with Afghan peace negotiator Abdullah in New Delhi earlier today. Reports say Abdullah was on a private visit to India. Jaishankar tweeted about the meeting. India, remember, is a major stakeholder in Afghanistan. In the past, India has supported a peace process that's Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and Afghan-controlled. It was only yesterday that India's External Affairs Ministry said that New Delhi supports the government and the people of Afghanistan in realizing their aspiration for a peaceful, democratic and prosperous future. Follow this space for more. In the meantime, we want to talk about a robot. Its name is Pepper, the world's first semi-humanoid robot. Pepper was promoted as a robot that understands human emotions. It was developed by SoftBank and Aldebaran Robotics. And no, it doesn't really understand human emotions, but in the past, it has proven to be multi-talented. It has worked at homes, as an assistant at stores, it has waited tables, even played a Buddhist priest. Watch this. Here is Pepper chanting sutras in a computerized voice. Pepper's CV is more diverse than you can think. In 2018, the robot was spotted outside the Smithsonian Museum. 3 years later, SoftBank has pulled the plug on Pepper. The sales of new Pepper units will end next year. The sales of refurbished units will go on for another 5 years. But why is Pepper being put to sleep? Turns out the humanoid failed to meet the expectations of humans. Pepper was unveiled in 2014, launched in Japan in 2015. It sold out within minutes, but it disappointed its buyers. In 2018, Pepper was fired from a supermarket job. Why? Because it was accused of confusing customers and not being able to help them. Pepper also had a stint as a security guard at Washington, D.C. But shortly after starting that job, Pepper drowned itself in a water fountain. In 2015, Pepper was kicked by a drunk man in Japan. He said the robot's attitude was displeasing. Despite everything, SoftBank tried to promote Pepper, even donating 25 robots to Smithsonian Museum. It hoped that Pepper units could fill in the shoes of museum guides. Looks like it couldn't. Does Pepper's failure tell a bigger story? Is Pepper proof of the failure of humanoids? Can they never really replace humans? Pepper is not the first semi-humanoid, by the way, to be discontinued. In 2018, Honda retired its robot, Asimo. It was the first robot to walk on 2 legs. It played football with former US President Barack Obama. In 2015, the next year, Asimo danced for German Chancellor Angela Merkel, even managed to click a selfie with former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. But somehow, Asimo never really managed to take off. The question is not whether humanoids can replace humans, but to what extent they can do what humans do. Today, robots are already cleaning our floors. Machines assist self-checkout at stores and self-check-in at airports. Drones are autonomous. Cars are self-driven. Parcels are being delivered without any human involvement. Robots are serving food, even comforting COVID patients. So no, Pepper is not the end of the humanoid story. Its unplugging highlights the gap between the demand and the supply of reliable humanoids. The humanoid market, in fact, is expected to touch $2.7 billion by 2025. 1 million units of humanoids are expected to be shipped globally by 2024. This is according to the Global Market Insights. The pandemic has fueled automation. It is true, most of us feel threatened by robots and humanoids. We fear losing our jobs. But here's the bitter truth. Businesses today are more open to efficient and co-effective humanoids than ever before. Pepper was costly, out of reach for most households. It would cost $1,800 in Japan, $20,000 for universities and businesses abroad. Pepper did not do justice to its price tag, so it had to go. As for Honda's Asimo, it could not catch up with the American competitors, the likes of Atlas, this one. Looks like semi-humanoids are here to stay. Today they are bartending, working at warehouses, and their ambassador, Sophia, the world's first humanoid, well, her makers, Hanson Robotics, are looking at mass-producing more Sophias. She's in demand, and how? And since we are talking about technology, in Britain, the government thought the pandemic was in the side mirrors. They loosened all restrictions and celebrated Freedom Day this week. And since then, British phones have been buzzing like crazy. Thousands of people are being pinged for possible contact with an infected person. You know what they're calling it? A pingdemic. Excellent wordplay. But what's the story here? Is there something wrong with Britain's tracing app, or is the outbreak really out of control? Our next report tells you.
Britons are facing a new pandemic. Phones that refuse to stop buzzing. They're calling it the Pingdemic. It all started with an app developed by the NHS, or the National Health Service. It's basically a contact tracing app. If you have been close to an infected person, the app will ping you. Great technology, but just one problem. Seems everyone in Britain is getting pinged. In the first week of July, 500,000 people were pinged. They were all asked to self-isolate for 10 days. You can imagine what happened next. People stopped going to work. Instead, they started raiding supermarkets and hoarding essentials.
We see over the coming 5 days, the situation get worse and worse. And it's almost exponential, the pinging we're seeing. In fact, we've actually lost 2 distribution sites due to the Pingdemic, and we're having to staff those from other parts of the UK.
The government has assured that there is no need to panic buy, but the pings just won't stop. At some businesses, 50% of the workforce is now in self-isolation. The cheer of Britain's Freedom Day has been replaced by fear. Fear of that elusive ping. But why is the app always on hyperdrive? Is it a technical glitch? Or is the outbreak really that big in the United Kingdom?
Government is encouraging everyone to download has really led to this pingdemic, and it means that someone gets pinged and told to self-isolate for a set amount of time. This has really affected all sectors across the UK, and it means that there has been a lot of staff shortages. It has critically affected the food industry. They had loudly complained, warning that there could be empty shelves if the government doesn't make their workers exempt.
Not the finest moment for British technology. How does the government plan to solve this pingdemic? One strategy is daily testing for critical food industry workers. Only those who test negative can head for work. In transport and emergency sectors, self-isolation rules have been loosened. So the ping isn't a death knell anymore. It's just a warning. While the technology has clearly tripped up Britain, we cannot ignore the virus trajectory. The country is recording around 50,000 new Wuhan virus cases every day, most of them from the Delta variant. So Britain clearly celebrated too early, and now it has an alarm that just won't stop. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
With a muted ceremony and an empty stadium, the much-delayed Tokyo Olympic Games have finally begun. The shadow of cancellation looms as the cases continue to rise. There's a lot at stake for Japan, apart from safety, prestige and public sentiment, all the money that they've pumped in. How much money are we talking about? $15.4 billion. 15.4, that's how much money Japan has put in, which makes this year's Olympics the most expensive in history ever. How much will Japan earn in return? Well, with no ticket sales this year, Japan will only earn a few billions through sponsorships and broadcasting rights. And this is the sad truth about Olympic Games in general, where host nations burn a hole in their pockets and earn peanuts. Of course, it's all in the spirit of the game, but time and again, the spirit has left countries with huge bills they cannot afford to pay, with some nations even slipping into recession after hosting an Olympic Games. Here's a report. On that note, it's a wrap. We're leaving you as always with Gravitas Images. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend.